Hello and welcome to the third episode of the Lab Maniacs Podcast. Joining me today is Cameron.
Hey, nice to be here. And we also have another guest, Dan.
Hi.
He's joining us today to talk about how to build on a budget. And since he's been putting out all those great articles, we thought we'd pull him on in here, finally, to join us and talk about how we can look at adjusting a budgetless deck down to something that's more manageable, or starting from scratch and working with a fixed budget and seeing what you can do. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's kind of cool to be on the podcast, given that it's not really my thing, it's your guys' thing.
Yeah, and we are definitely happy to have you here. However, before we get into the nitty-gritty and all, we've got some fairly big announcements to make. Cameron, why don't you go ahead and tell us?
Yes, we've got a bunch of things coming up with the Lab Maniacs. Right off the bat, June 24th, we are trying to organize a streamed gameplay day. So the Lab Maniacs, we've got the time off, and we're going to be streaming some games through Twitch of us playing competitive EDH, either with us as a group or with other people from the Play EDH Discord. So as an audience, if you guys are wanting to get involved, if you're wanting to try one of your decks against one of ours, I definitely would encourage you to join the Play EDH Discord and get involved. We'll be organizing games with people from there. We are also trying to see if we can include cockatrice. It's a little bit on the technical side that we're having to deal with, but we're going to see how it goes and hope to be able to include as many people as possible. With that, on June 24th, we are also launching a Patreon. If you would like to support the Lab Maniacs and our production efforts, as well as future developments, we are giving you an outlet to do that. We'll be putting the page live on the 24th, and we have several different ranges and different things we'll be doing. One of the possibilities is watching myself actually do the video editing for these, as well as go through some of the post-production. And there's several other tiers out there. So we hope to be able to show that to you. Leading up, right after that play day, June 26th is going to be our first video for season 2 of the Lab Maniacs. We're really excited for that.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, those are the big ones for right now. We've got a ton of things that we're still working on. We're just not quite ready to do yet. And we'll go from there.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be an exciting time for the Laboratory Maniacs in the next couple of months. I myself can't wait to get back into releasing gameplay and deck tech videos and all the other stuff we're going to have coming. It's going to be great.
It's a really big highlight to my Monday, even though I'm the one doing all the work for it. It's a nice boost of adrenaline to get through those really terrible Monday work days.
I can imagine. All right, now that we've done all of the announcement stuff, there's one more thing to do before we get to our main topic. We have been asked to talk about how we feel about the 1v1 Magic Online EDH League ban list. Dan, why don't you start us off? How are your feelings about that particular ban list?
So it's hard for me to make a really informed opinion because I have no significant experience with either French nor Leviathan, so I don't come from a background of 1v1 EDH. That being said, my first impressions of it were not great, just because it looked like such a significant departure from the fairly successful 1v1 ban lists, and a lot of the 5.0 deck lists getting posted recently have shown, some amount of real homogenization of the meta. So first you had the Baral domination of the early weeks, and now it's pretty much 50% Vile Crown decks. Like, it's not a good meta when a good half of your decks are nearly 100 card identical.
Yeah, that's It's definitely true. I mean, we saw the same issue in French Commander when after Vile Smasher came out and they went down to 20 life, with surprisingly also Crom and Vile Smasher dominating. Cameron, what's your personal take on the 1v1 MTGO EDH ban list?
I'm kind of sad how much the 2017 Commander product is influencing the format. Vile Smasher being the really big one. But I mean, as Dan said, the fact that so many of the decks are so homogenous, it makes for a very unhealthy meta. We're kind of feeling the same way with Thrasios in multiplayer, just not online, where one commander is so huge and so format warping that it's getting really stale to just see so much of the exact same thing. I think the way that they crafted the ban list made it very control and mid-range heavy. And I think they were really trying to make aggro possible, but they did not. I mean, from the very start, they left in Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time. They took out all of the fast mana. They removed the majority of the big combo engines. And that pretty much just leaves draw, go, control, where you try to play cheap counter spells and things with flash, or unbeatable win conditions. Like Emrakul, when you've got a deck that literally has no creatures in it except for counterspells, draw cards, and an Emrakul, and then a commander that lets you polymorph for cheaper than normal into said Emrakul, it makes for a not so healthy meta. But now Crom and Vile Smasher are very similar in the same way. It's overwhelming. I'm hoping that they realize that they've kind of painted the meta into a corner and they really need to change it. I'm kind of sad that Tassiger disappeared, at least from a lot of the snapshots. I personally don't play 1v1 that much.
Yeah. I mean, as you're putting it, homogenization of the meta is definitely an issue. However, I don't think that particular aspect should be, let's say, focused on too much. I mean, the 1v1 EDH format is closer to something like Legacy or Vintage than it is to multiplayer EDH, especially in regards to what kind of data people have and the way in which they can, let's say, extract the best lists in the format.
So the homogenization, I think, is actually a very valid point to talk about, because we see this with Hearthstone and how after a month you have the same. I mean, we saw this with Pirate Warrior for a very long time, or when we were dealing with Jade Druid for forever in Hearthstone. Having homogenization in the format removes players. It makes it boring. It makes it so, well, you kind of know what's happening, but it does not make it for fun and interesting games where you have to actually really think through it. Because when everything plays the exact same way every single time, there's not a lot of capturing gameplay.
See, I also agree with you that homogenization as a whole is definitely not a good thing. The only thing I'm saying is that this apparent homogenization shouldn't be paid too much heed to when it comes to alterations of the ban list. So let's say if Vile Smasher and Crom are still the dominating decks after 2 weeks or so, and they want to make another announcement, then they shouldn't just look towards, let's say, banning one of those two as a commander or something like that. They should rather focus on shifting the format back to where other types of decks can also exist, since from what we've seen so far, as you had said earlier, all the dominating decks seem to be of the control variant.
Yes, it's way too difficult to play an aggro deck in that regard. It's something where the ban list needs to get some major changes in order to be able to support an aggro in there, and combo is pretty much just stripped pretty bare right now.
It's really hard to comment on because I'm honestly not sure what they can do that aren't like as sweeping a change as their implementation of this ban list to structure it in a way that you can have aggro be possible. With Oloro legal in the format, with Vial Smasher legal in the format, I mean, Vial Smasher is functionally a control deck that plays the aggro game better than an aggro commander possibly can.
That's true.
I know Zergo, the Dash Zergo had a lot of success at 20 life in French. But like, I don't know if a life total shift is a relevant change they can make that will actually enable that kind of gameplay. I think they should certainly be giving it several weeks between changes to let the format shake itself out. It's just, I don't know, it's a hard spot to be in, honestly. I don't envy them for that. I do envy the amount of data, but I don't envy their position.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Making what's basically an entirely new format and then trying to get it into shape as quickly as possible is not an easy thing to do. So they are going to have quite the task ahead of them. And so are we, because it's finally time to talk about today's main topic, getting into competitive EDH from a financial standpoint. As we all know, cEDH deck lists are expensive. We're talking $3,000 and upwards. And as anyone who has, let's say, a normal or not too high income or no income at all, affording a competitive deck list in paper is going to be really hard.
Yes, I entirely agree. I'm kind of in an interesting spot because I was able to start picking these off one at a time. And I think that's kind of what the route that some people may want to start approaching. It's a challenge. It's a goal. It's something to work towards, but it's not something everybody can do. Everybody can't really put the time towards that or the massive amount of money to make that deck right away. So let's go through some other options we have.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. And I mean, we've got the perfect man for it here. Dan, why don't you tell us about how you approach building competitive decks on a budget in general? Some basic principles, maybe.
Yeah, sure. So there's a whole lot of different ways that you can do this because, you know, building a deck is an incredibly complex process. You got 100 cards that you want to pick. You got 15,000 options at this point, you know, minus like a couple like Leovold and stuff. But you have to go about figuring out what your strategy is, just like with any other deck. But the additional wrinkle is that, in my mind, there's not only this power concentration, how do I want to pick out and allot slots for specific strategies, there's also this money concentration. Do I want to make sure that I have a smooth financial curve? Do I want to have equal money invested in my mana base so that I can have efficient and consistent mana? Do I want to have most of my money invested in a particular strategy so I can actually employ, you know, a Bomberman combo with Thrasios? Well, Lion's Eye Diamond is a significant investment. Do I want to have the mana invested in ramp so I can get to whatever strategy I choose faster? How you allocate your funds is incredibly important.
One thing I would like to point out, and one of the big lessons I've learned from watching some of the professionals stream or post videos on YouTube, like through Channel Fireball, LSV has said that it doesn't matter what spells you have in your deck. If you don't have the mana to actually cast those spells, you can't actually cast them. And it really points to the value of having a good land base and having a good mana base. So having to address where you put your money, 99 times out of 100, investment in a land base is probably your best investment because it will be the one that can spread out as far as possible. When you change decks, your land base will pretty much stay with you.
Yeah, that's completely true. Land bases for competitive EDH are quite expensive, but one of the things that we've already said we value in competitive decks is high consistency. And a lot of that high consistency comes from having the proper mana to be able to do stuff. Now, that can be quite complicated as your budget gets constrained, but one first simple option to do that would be to reduce the amount of different colors you play.
Yeah, it's been really eye-opening trying to budget various different color amount decks. So I've only done 5 budget deck series posts so far, but it is significantly easier to get a consistent and powerful Chainveil Teferi list at $400 than it is to get a consistent and powerful Thrasios Vial Smasher Paradox Scepter list at $400.
Or a Hermit Druid.
Yeah, or a Hermit Druid list.
Oh god, Hermit Druid at $400. That's painful.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was crazy. Yeah.
But like Cameron was saying, the mana base is so incredibly important. If you look at some of the different posts I've made, I will do my utmost to preserve at the very least, shock fetch mana base in these 4-color decks, at least through the first several deck cuts, going so far as to even keep things like Tropical Island in these lists when I go down to my first budget constraints. So even though I'm cutting some incredibly powerful spells, I'm doing my best to leave at least the most powerful of the dual lands for your turn 1 plays, and to leave your fetch land mana base. And even as far as down all the way to my second to last step, which is at around $400, I'm leaving some portion of those shocks, those fetches in, so that you can have a reasonable amount of consistency.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, kind of one of the ideas for the way you're doing your deck lists is you're going from a budgetless list, and you're stripping out different portions of the deck based off the budget and putting inline replacements. Or if you can't do an inline replacement, example of an inline replacement and what I'm talking about, you take Time Twister, and an inline replacement on a very budget end is Days Undoing.
Yeah, that's like the Time Twister example is probably one that highlights that really well. Time Twister loops have been a somewhat popular win condition in some competitive decks for a while, and they're kinda not possible to do with basically any wheel type spell that's not Time Twister, since every other wheel spell just either exiles itself or doesn't shuffle your stuff back in. And that's where those modular combos come into play. So not only do you look at replacing cards with functional equivalents or cards that are functionally similar, you can also replace cards or even entire card packages with things that do different things, but do those efficiently for a lower financial cost.
Yes, an example of this, and one of the reasons why some of Dan's stripping down of a deck and maintaining a tropical island in the list, even at the $400 range, helps, is because it lets you look at different aspects of the deck. An example package is Life from the Loam. It is a very grindy, long-term value engine, and it loses a lot of power when you lose fetch lands from the deck. As long as you have fetch lands and you have targets for fetch lands, Life from the Loam continues to get value through the majority of the game. And it's one of those kind of free cards where you can add a few other cards in a package to a deck and get the value out of it. But as soon as you start taking out fetch lands and targets for fetch lands, you start having to reevaluate those 3 or 4 cards and say, are they very worthwhile?
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how a deck almost wants those packages it holds to change. And like going off of that Tasigur list, there are, a little bit of Reanimator sub-themes in the budgetless version, but that becomes such an efficient route to victory as you get at a lower price point. So a card like Chains of Mephistopheles, incredibly powerful, also incredibly expensive. That's never going to fit on a budget. It eclipsed both of the entire cost of the deck list, so the 2 lower versions. That's just not feasible to include. The entire deck would be basic lands, and even those cost more. It just doesn't work. But starting to put things like Satyr Wayfinder, Mulch, Grisly Salvage, Buried Alive, and including cards like Void Winnower or Terastodon, you have these incredibly financially cheap cards that do have powerful effects. Void Winnower is an extremely strong Magic card. It's obviously a little awkward for various meta reasons, but it's $2. That is a great effect to get into play for $2.
Yeah, one big thing about taking a pre-made or an existing list and making a budget version of it is that preserving the strategical integrity of the list is really important. You basically still want to be doing the same thing, you just want to do it while not spending a ton of money. And what also goes hand in hand with that is you also want the list to still be as competitive as possible. Like, just building it on a budget, in this case, doesn't mean that you're building it casually in some way, or that you're restricting yourself on anything other than money.
Totally. One thing of note with that is you might also want to talk with deck creators, people that have made those lists, and see if there's a community around it. I know on cEDH, we have a channel that just lists different Commander Discord channels so that people can join a Discord server just to talk about a specific commander and how to brew it and how to play it, so that you can talk to people who are working through this competitive deck list and trying to figure out what other options there are. And there's a good chance that the person who created this list looked through several other options and chose the best one, but not based off of budget. And there probably are about 5 different ways you could go at several different price points that they already know straight off the top of their head, or the community as a whole has already kind of worked through, and you don't have to do that work from the ground up when trying to recreate that deck on a budget.
Yeah, when I'm making these posts, every single time I'm working through these deck lists, I will always go to the active players of the budget list and pass the whole thing by them. Say, hey, what do you think about this? Is this a reasonable idea for how to pare things down on a budget? When I was working on the Teferi post, Sigi was able to direct me, oh, well, you can actually do Chainveil loops with Jace Architect of Thought. He is so much cheaper than Ugin or Jace the Mind Sculptor at doing these Chainveil loops. He's not quite as efficient at it, but it still works. And at $200, that's what you're looking for.
Yep.
The changes that you have to go through for a deck are often best able to be recommended by those people that have been working through them.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And one of the changes I remember you making to the almost extreme budget lists of Teferi was replacing the expensive rocks like Grim Monolith and Mana Vault and that kind of stuff with cards like Worn Power Stone. Now, nobody in their right mind would play Worn Power Stone in a fully competitive, no-budget Teferi list, but the important part about adding it to the cheap version was that you still needed cards that were 1 permanent and tapped for 3 or 2 mana. And that's a great example of preserving strategic integrity and intent for a deck.
It's also interestingly important to note when you have to be able to adjust or change what that strategy is. So in one of the posts that I've been working on recently, it became necessary to actually pair out different portions of the strategy to the point where a Null Rod list in a budget list version was running 8 or so mana rocks by the time we got down to a $400 list. And having talked this over with Lurker specifically, he actually thinks that it is the correct decision. It's the only way you can actually keep the core of the deck while still making this work on a budget. So identifying what strategic components you want to keep and what have to get abandoned to be able to realistically get to the correct budget is also something you want to be aware of.
Making sure the deck can function is probably the biggest core of the budget portion. And it's one thing that inline replacements can sometimes lose. And generally, after each round of budget runs that you go through, when you say, all right, I'm looking at $500, these are the cards I have, you need to go back and look at the deck as a whole and each different section of the deck to make sure that it can still function. At the same time, you may find that there are other options. Say in the Dramatic Reversal and Isochron Scepter route on Tasigur, you can replace certain tutors with a Muddle the Mixture because it on its own can get both sides of Dramatic Reversal and Isochron Scepter, and it can save you a lot of money. So there's some other things besides just doing inline replacements, looking back at the deck that you want to do and making sure that everything that you have works together to go for that goal.
Absolutely. Now, what we've been talking about so far is basically one of the big three ways of looking at budget lists, and that's making a budget version of an existing list. Now, Dan, are there any things that you personally would do differently if you didn't make a budget version of an existing deck, but rather started a deck from scratch with budget in mind?
Absolutely. I think, so when you look at various competitive decks, what we had talked about with these modular packages, you can identify the relative cost of these packages right up front. I can tell you, Twister Loops, completely unreasonable for a budget deck. Bomberman combo, realistically, that's going to be too much for a budget deck. But you get to something like the Dramatic Scepter combo. All you need is a pile of mana rocks. And mana rocks don't have to be expensive. Signets, talismans, the diamond cycle that come into play tapped, Felwar Stone, Soul Ring, these are all really cheap. So that might be a package you want to look at. Things like Seasons Past loops. Sure, you can run it with Grim Tutor and Demonic Tutor, but you can also do it with something like Beseech the Queen and Diabolic Tutor. Like, you can go from these packages that cost hundreds of dollars to packages that only actually cost like, $1 or $2. So if I was building a budget cEDH deck from the ground up, my first step would be to find what are powerful packages that budgetless competitive decks do employ that are relatively low cost financially. And I would start from there. Pull in pieces that I like, look at different support pieces, consider how effective it is at different color combinations, and try and find a 1 or 2 color commander that can facilitate these low financial cost packages. And that is how I would go about building a really low cost competitive deck from the ground up.
I could totally agree with that. The big thing there is finding your win condition and then trying to find the existing things that kind of work. An example of a package that's just fairly cheap but isn't necessarily competitive would be Sword of the Meek and Thopter Foundry. It's one of those pet packages that I've had that I always try to make it possible to play with, but I can't really fit it in a competitive deck. But there's so many different ones that are in competitive, and they're all at so many variable price ranges. I really do love the versatility of them. With Dramatic Reversal and Isochron Scepter, you can go to Worn Power Stone levels of, I just need to barely get there. Or Seasons Past, you can find interesting ways by looking at the other cards that are out there.
Yeah, so to sum up what we've talked about, cEDH is expensive, but it's certainly possible and actually quite reasonable to play it on a budget. There are a couple of different ways to do it. You can either use pre-built budget lists that were made by the creators of decks or people like Dan that put immediate effort into making those lists. You can build a list as a budget deck from the start while keeping in mind different things, or you yourself can make a budget version of an existing deck.
One thing of note here in the format is that we would like the format to grow. We want more people to be playing with us so that we can have more varied experiences and have a good time and share the fun of competitive EDH. And like every format out there, there are usually low-lying decks that people have made it a point to create so that people can get into the format and experience the format. A classic example of this is Burn in Legacy. One of the ones for competitive EDH is Yisan the Wandering Bard. You can get very, very low entry fee into competitive EDH. At the same time, we would really like to point out how easy it is to adjust these decks' budgets downward to the point of being able to play at a $400 or $500 level. We do acknowledge you're not going to be playing it at the same consistency or full potential as a budgetless deck, but you'll still be able to get into the mix of things and have fun stepping toe-to-toe with the people that are playing budgetless. It's not like you're going to necessarily lose right away. The fact that people had more money or were lucky at a time to buy cards for cheaper doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily always win. The fact that some of these cards are really inline replacements without being that much more expensive, they just have some minor changes, really does point to how diverse you can play these things.
Oh yeah, totally. One great example of a budget list doing well, even in a fully competitive environment, would actually be building a deck's success with his budget Tessiger control list in the competitive EDH tournament we had recently.
Oh yeah, I worked with him on that when he started creating it. Now, since then, I kicked off the Discord and we've got about 5 or 6 people that are fairly active on there. If anybody's got questions, we kind of walk them through what all we're looking to do. I mean, we've got people with different strategies too. One of the guys on there is running a Tidespout Tyrant Oath of the Druids Tessiger deck, which is
okay,
really spicy. It's a different route. I know it's probably 15, 20 cards different, but on the same strategy of trying to go control and then landing an infinite win con.
Yeah, budget decks do not, especially when you get to, let's say, around the like $1,000 price point, when you're able to invest that much into these lists, they really hold up a lot of the power that the budget list decks have. I have had numerous games taken off me by the $1,000 food chain Tazri list that Shaper Savant and probably also Big Lupu worked on when I was playing just budgetless lists, because, you know, once you get to the point where you can have most of the mana rocks and most of the Fetch Shock mana base, even if you don't have original duels, you know, you can still get by. So working up to that point might be a little awkward compared to some decks you might play, but once you get there, after, you know, a couple weeks or months or whatever your scale of building up is, that is a price point that can definitely compete.
That's kind of a nice thing, because in a way, this ties into the whole progression you're making as a person that goes from playing EDH casually to getting into competitive EDH. You're slowly but surely getting better, getting more invested into the game, and in a way, you can sort of reward yourself by slowly but surely accumulating those more expensive and more powerful staple cards. And with that, we've talked enough about budget for this episode. Thank you very much for joining us, Dan. You have been a fantastic guest. Thank you also for joining me as usual, Cameron.
Anytime.
We are the Laboratory Maniacs, and we'll be seeing you next time.